This video is brought to you by our own Meta. Thank you so much for donating. If you want to support Brackeys yourself, you can go to patreon.com/Brackeys.
Thanks for tuning in at Brackeys.
Hello everyone and welcome to this video on creating a tower defense game in Unity. Today we'll be adding a lives counter to our player stats, and we'll also be displaying that on the UI. We'll also start creating a game manager that will do something whenever we run out of lives. For now we'll just throw a debug.log statement. And we'll also add some health to our enemies and a cool death effect whenever they die. So let's just get right into it. So you can see I'm here in Unity, and what I want to begin with is adding some way to keep track of how many lives we have left. So let's find our player stat script and double click that to open it up in Visual Studio. And then we can add a new variable to this, and this is also going to be a public static variable, just like our money. So we'll make a public static integer with the amount of lives. Then we'll also create a public integer that is non-static with the amount of lives that we want to start with. So our start lives, and we'll just default that to something like 20. Then down in our start method, we set lives equal to start lives. Whoops, start lives. There we go. So whenever we start the game, our lives will be initialized with a value of 20. But right now we can't really see this happening. So in order to display this on the screen, let's create some UI. You can see that we have our first canvas here, and this is the overlay canvas that is just put on top of the screen. We also have another canvas here, which is our world canvas that is shown at the bottom of our map. And let's go ahead and rename these properly. So let's have this be our overlay canvas. And this one be the bottom canvas. So now that they are named accordingly, we can go ahead and duplicate our bottom canvas by pressing Ctrl D or Command D if you're on the Mac. And let's just move this up. I will also switch to the front or the top view here by pressing on the Y-axis. This will just give me a better overview of what's going on, and switch to the 2D tools over here so that we can easily manipulate the canvas. So now that we've moved this up to the top, this is where I want to display our lives. So let's rename this here to top canvas. And let's also maybe change the format of this a tiny bit. So the first thing that I want to do is change the scale to something like 0.1 times 0.1 times 0.1. And that makes it really huge. Then I want to fit it back in here with our map and just drag it up a bit and make some more room. Then I want to take our money element here and just flat out delete that. And instead, let's edit our timer. So right now you can see it scales with our screen. Again, make sure that it does that by going to stretch and holding down Alt and clicking in the bottom right corner. And then what we can do is maybe centering this on the X here and then snapping it to the bottom so that it will sit right on top of our map. Then we can maybe take our entire canvas and drag it down a little bit to decrease the distance from our map to the font. And then we can rename this one to our lives. And let's put some actual text in here. So let's say 20 lives. And let's just increase the size of this so we can put our font size to something like maybe 204. And I think that looks pretty good. And we can maybe even decrease the size here or the distance here from the map, just drag it down a tiny bit more. So I think overall this looks pretty great. And I think it's very dramatic displaying the lives in such a big way. So it's pretty essential to display important information in large places so that the user can't help but notice how many lives he has left. So now what we can do is maybe link this so that it will actually change with our actual live amount. So let's go onto our lives here and create a new component. Just like we added the money UI, we'll have a very little simple script here called the lives UI. Let's just hit create an add on that and double click it to open it up in Visual Studio. And let's just reload this. And you can see that we can just quickly edit this class. First off, we'll be implementing Unity Engine.ui so that we can now create a variable up here with a reference to our text. And then we'll call this one the live text. Then what we can do is every time in the update function, and yes, this might not again be the most efficient way, but because our game is so small, this is really not going to matter. If you're pushing to mobile, you might want to consider doing this in a coroutine instead, or having it linked to the player stats in some way. But for now, we can simply go and check for this each time we do the update. And we're simply going to check if, or not check, we're simply going to set live.text here lives text.text equal to player stats dot lives. There you go. And that should, of course, this is now an integer, so we need to convert it into a string. But we actually don't need to do this whenever we add a string onto it. And we want to add space lives onto the number here. And that actually makes Unity convert this into a string automatically. But if you want to be explicit, you can just as well do .toString in there just to be very clear about what you're doing. But that's completely up to you. So now that we've actually done this, we can go back into Unity. And we, of course, want to link our text object up to this script. So let's just drag our text into the lives text field. Cool. So this will actually not be noticeable if you just hit play right now. We won't get any errors, but nothing will change. And that's because our lives, well, they start at 20 and they don't change in any way. So what we'll do is just go to our game master, go under player stats, and then change our start lives to something like 12 just to see them change. So let's hit play here, and they will now say 12 lives. So that's awesome. So let's just put this at 1 for testing, and we can see what happens when we decrease the lives and when we go to 0. So let's have a look at that. I also want to change the wave spawn here, where the time between waves should be 10 instead of 20. I think that's too much. And I will also go into our prefabs and find our enemy, and make sure to increase the speed here to 50 just when testing, so we don't have to wait that long. Then what I'll do is double click on the enemy script, and let's have a look at what happens when he reaches the last waypoint, which is the end of his path. So in this case, we want to reduce the amount of lives the player has, and we probably want to destroy our enemy here. So right now we are simply destroying the enemy and then returning. I want to put this into a separate function so we have a clear overview of what's going on. So whenever you have the ability to group little pieces of code like this, for example, changing the amount of lives and destroying the object, which can all be categorized under path ended or end path or something like that, then you pretty much want to do that. So let's just put the destroy call in here. And let's now call end path here. And then we can set lives or player stats dot lives minus minus. That means minus equals 1. Cool. So now when we go in and hit play, we should see that our little enemy spawns and he runs through, and you can see there's a cattail on the cam here. And when he reaches the end, our lives change to 0. Say hi. All right. And you can see when we have more enemies spawn here, when they go through, we should get to -1 and then -2. Of course, we don't want that to happen. We want something special to happen whenever we reach a lives amount of 0. So let's go ahead and add this functionality. One thing you could do here is have some kind of method that you call on the player stats to reduce the lives, and just instead of just changing it directly, you could have some method in here, some public method called reduce or subtract lives or whatever. And then you could have that keep track of how many lives we have. And if that goes below 0, we could have a call to a separate object, say a game manager, that will then do some stuff. But instead of interlinking them in all these ways, because that is maybe a bit more advanced, and something that I recommend you do if you want to create a very large games with a lot of moving components and that needs to be very optimized, instead we'll just create a game manager that simply sits and checks our lives amount and then handles everything locally. If you want to do it the other way, I suggest you look at the 2D platformer course, because that shows a lot of ways to do that kind of stuff and how to kind of cheat your way to some singleton objects if that is something that interests you. So let's just go ahead and create a new component here on the game master, and let's call this one our game manager. And this will be kind of essential for whenever we need to end a game, restart a game, maybe pause a game at a later point, we'll see. So what we'll do in here is we'll have a update method, which we have here, and that is going to check if player stats dot lives is less than, and whoops, let's close that one, is less than or equal to 0. So in case we reach 0 lives, or for some reason if two enemies enter at the same time and we reach -1 lives or so, then we want to end the game. So let's do end game. And let's make this a separate function here, end game. And we can just make it private because we only want to call it from inside of the game manager itself. And we'll just for now throw a debug.log statement saying that the game has ended. So game over. And then you could of course go ahead and restart the level here using something like scene manager.load scene or load level. And then you could use the currently active level, or you could prompt the user with some kind of end screen. We can do lots of stuff here, and we'll definitely add something in at a later point. But for now, we'll just throw this debug.log statement, and that's pretty much it. However, one thing that you will notice is if we go ahead and try this out, and this should definitely work, is that when we reach 0 lives here, so our enemy is spawned and he goes through the entire path, and once he reaches the end, it spams game over down here. And we only want to do that once, because if we want to display some kind of game over screen, we don't want 20 or 30 or 100 game over screens popping up in just a few seconds. We only want one. So what we do is simply add a boolean up here, and you can make this a private boolean. You could also make it a public static if you want other objects to know whether or not the game has ended. And we'll call this one game ended, and set it equal to false by default. And then down here we'll set game ended equal to true. And then up here in our update method, we can say that if the game has ended, well then we just want to return. Then we don't want to continue down and do all of this other stuff. We simply exit out of the loop. Awesome. So now when we hit play and see that our enemy runs through the map, and he's going to do that pretty quickly, excuse me, and reaches the end here, it says game over just once, and there you go. Awesome. So the next thing that I wanted to do was add some way of damaging our enemies, because right now when we add a tower and it shoots the enemy, the bullet then simply destroys the enemy object and nothing really happens. I want to be able to add some more money to our player. I want to have a cool death effect, and maybe even have the ability to give different damage amounts to different bullets, so that we can have different turrets damage in different ways. That's a lot of different. So what we'll do is we will find the place where we currently destroy our enemies, and that is inside of our scripts. And then if we find our bullet C# script here and double click that to open it up in Visual Studio, and you can see that down here where we have a function called damage, it simply destroys the enemy. So what we'll do instead here is have some function inside of our enemy that will allow us to take damage. So let's go into our enemy here and begin by adding a new variable. And this is going to be a public integer, and this is going to be our health. And we'll just default that to say 100, but you can of course input anything that you want. Then we'll create a new method, and this is going to be a public void because we'll access it from without the class. So we'll access it from our bullet class using a reference, and then we'll call this one take damage, and we'll specify the amount of damage as a parameter here, so as an argument, and that is going to be an integer with the amount. And then we'll simply say that our health minus equals our amount. So we'll just subtract the amount from our health. And then we can say that if health is less than or equal to 0, so in case we die, well then we want to call some kind of die method. And that is yet another method that we want to create. So let's just create a private method here called die. And we no longer need this to be public because we are calling this from inside of this function. And that of course sits on the class, so that can just be a private variable. And all we'll do here for now is just destroy the object. So right now we'll just destroy the game object, and then in a moment we'll create a cool effect whenever this happens. And we'll also make sure to add some money. So once we've done that, we can go into a bullet, and now we want a way of using this transform enemy, so this enemy transform, and then getting the component called enemy on that object, because right now the enemy transform is this entire object right here. We want to seek down this particular component here, the enemy component, and we'll want to go into that and call this particular function. So the way that we do that is by first getting the component. And to do this, we simply go enemy.getComponent. And the component we want to get is of type enemy. Then we can store this component in a variable. We'll call of type enemy. And we'll just call this E. The reason why I call it E here, we could just as well call it enemy, but we need to differentiate between this new variable, which is the component, and the other one, which is our entire object. So this is the entire transform. So what we could do as well is just call this one enemy go for a game object or something like that, and then have this one be enemy, but I'll just call it E for short. Then what we do is say E.takeDamage. And now we can simply pass in some amount. We could pass in a fixed amount of 20 damage, or we could go up here and add a damage parameter to our bullet. So let's just do that. So let's create a variable here, a public integer with the damage, and set that equal to 50 by default. This way we can go into all of the different bullet prefabs, such as the missile and the bullet, and later we might have some other stuff in there, and change the damage individually for each one. Then down here we pass in the damage. And that makes sure to throw it over to the take damage, which is over here. One thing that might happen is we might get an enemy who doesn't have an enemy component. This might be something that we want to happen purposefully in the future, or we might just, well, screw up. So what we'll do here is we'll just check if E is not equal to null. Well, then we want to do this. If it is, then we're screwed. Awesome. And then we can delete the destroy thing down here. We really don't need that. Cool. So this should actually work. So if we now go in here and everything is set up, and we'll just change the speed of our enemy back to say 10. And you can see we have a health here, and on our bullet, we also have a damage. And the same thing with our, if we find it here, our missile launcher also, or not our missile launcher, our missile also has a damage. So we could, of course, change these around. So what we can do now is simply hit play and wait for an enemy to spawn. And we can just add a few turrets here. And you can see 1-2 shots and then the enemy is dead. So it does take 2 shots now to kill the enemy. That's awesome. So the next thing that we could do here is find our enemy and then add some more functionality whenever he dies. For example, we could add on some money. So, and this is why we group into small functions here, so we can very easily go in and add more functionality and have a and very clearly see where the functionality should go. And of course, we want to add more money only when our enemy dies. So we can go up here and make this another variable. It's going to be a public integer, and this could be the value or the price or whatever. Let's just put value here. You could also say money or money gain, whatever. We'll just put value in here, and we'll have this default to something like, I don't know, the prices here are 100 and 250. So let's make one of these give say $50. And we'll just down here say player stats dot money plus equals our value. Cool. So that should actually work. So if we now hit play and kill off one of these guys, and you can see very clearly here that it's going to take 2 shots, 1 and 2, and our money just increased by 50. So you see here it says start build, money left 300 plus 50 is 350. And we can just keep on doing this, and our money will decrease whenever we build and increase whenever we shoot someone. Awesome. So the last thing here is just adding in a cool effect. So let's actually create that cool effect, and we'll use one of the prefabs here as a starting point. So let's use our we'll use the bullet impact effect as a starting point. So let's drag this inside of our scene, focus in on it. I'm going to shift away from the top view here and just move it up a tiny bit. Something like that looks fine. And then we can rename this to enemy death effect. And wow, Apple wants me to spend money. There we go. And then we can redrag this into our prefabs folder. There we go. So make it into a new prefab so we don't overwrite the old one. And let's configure some stuff here. So the first thing is I want to go into my renderer. Actually, the first thing is I want to enable looping and set that to 2 and hit simulate. There we go. So now we can see the changes correctly. So I want to go into my renderer and change the material here to the material of our enemy. There we go. So that it will look like the enemy shatters into multiple pieces. And I'm going to go pretty quickly through this. So let's go into our shape. Let's change the radius to 1. And we don't want to change anything else here. Let's go into emission. Change this to something like between maybe 15 and 20. That's going to be plenty. And then we can go up here. Change the start lifetime, that's going to be fine. The start speed to somewhere between 0 and 5 sounds fine by me. And then the start size between 0.25 and 0.35, just to make them a bit clearer to see. There we go. Everything else here can be left untouched. We could put in a bit of start rotation, so I'm going to do 100 there and randomize that by 1. There we go. I think that looks pretty good. Then what we can do is go down and find our collision tab, and we'll just make sure to kind of raise these a bit above the ground, and we do that by going in here, changing the radius scale to 1. There we go. It pops up and everything looks much better, and I kind of like how this is looking now. And maybe we can just disable interior collisions, and everything else is good. Awesome. So that is kind of the effect that I'm going for, and you can of course spend more time. It will also be cool to add in a light, just as we did with the missile exploding effect, just to make things a bit more dramatic, but I'll leave that up to you. So we can now hit apply on this as soon as we've turned up looping, of course. And let's delete this from our scene. Let's go in and add the ability to spawn this in through code. So we'll need a reference to the effect here. So we'll make a public game object, and we've done this multiple times. This is going to be our death effect. Then we can go down here to where we want it to be spawned. We'll call instantiate. We'll pass in our death effect as the prefab. We'll say that we want to spawn it at our current position, which is transformed up position, and with no rotation, which means quaternion.identity. And we'll of course make sure to store this in a variable called effect and cast it into a game object. There we go. And then this way we can make sure to destroy that effect after, say, 5 seconds, just to clean up the scene a little bit. And I'm going to add the money here way at the top, kind of to group things a bit better. Something like that looks really neat. And now if we find our enemy prefab, we have a slot here for the death effect. Let's drag our enemy death effect into that slot, hit no applying there because it's in our project, and hit play, and things should look freaking awesome. So let's try this out. And indeed it does. So I really like that effect. It's very subtle, it's very clean. It could definitely do with some bigger explosions and some light effects, but I'll leave that up to you. I think you can definitely get away with these graphics, and I think they're really funny and cartoony. So let's just keep it this way for now. So that was pretty much it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you so much to all of the awesome people who donated in September, and a special thanks to Arun Mehta, Robert Roche, James Calhoun, Kim Roes Gugos, Bao Andan Duang, and Vixen P. Thank you so much for donating. You guys are awesome. If you want to support Brackeys yourself, you can go to patreon.com/Brackeys.